yeah, okay, maybe if you go to Tibet and spend 20 years meditating on the side of a mountain, you can reach non-duality and that awareness and the cosmic consciousness. But I don't think a guided meditation on YouTube is going to get you anywhere near where 5-MeO does.
It's a shortcut. It's cheating, isn't it?
Yeah, I've heard that one.
All right. Welcome back to the Alternative Flight Plan podcast. This is where we explore healing paths your conventional medical provider may not even chart. After my time in the Naval Service, I've learned that few things are more important than creativity and adaptability. And I think these apply even more so in navigating today's really interesting healthcare landscape. My guest today is Andrew M. Weisse. He's the writer and publisher of the Psychedelic blog, which is how I found him, which is a Substack examining how psychedelics influence relationships, culture, the human experience, and even our relationship with death. His work looks beyond the familiar healing narrative, which is one of the things I really want to dig into today, and exploring how these substances reshape desire, transform connection, and shift how we relate to meaning and reality. Today, Andrew and I are going to explore possibilities for plant medicine and extend far beyond healing alone into entirely new ways of understanding ourselves and the world around us. So without further ado, let's taxi to the catapult and get airborne. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, I'm going to admit I'm a little nervous. I don't talk to a lot of folks that I don't know personally. Although I guess in some way, after reading your Substack for these last couple of months, maybe I've learned a little bit more about you and how you tick. For those that don't follow Andrew on Substack, I've been following him for a couple of months now, and as I've watched your writing unfold, I've become increasingly interested in your perspective and point of view. So with that, is there anything in particular that you'd like to start with, or we can just dive into some of those meaty topics that we mentioned in the intro?
Yeah, I'd say let's just dive in.
Okay. One of the most interesting exchanges I've had in talking to folks about plant medicine is a conversation I had with a colleague. Well, it's going on almost 2 or 3 years now. And apparently the conversation hit home in a way. I got a handwritten note back that said the devil had me right where he wanted me, which I thought was interesting in light of what I thought was a great conversation. So, and the reason I mentioned that is because I know this person drinks alcohol, which you write a lot about. And so let's start by just unpacking a little bit of the social conditioning around psychedelics and the social conditioning around things like alcohol and cigarettes.
Yeah, great place to start. And as you mentioned, something I've explored extensively. I think, in many ways, it's like the proverbial fish in water. Many people will just accept, the laws, the culture, whatever the state has kind of conditioned. Very few people unmoor themselves and actually look at their lives and the substances that they enjoy objectively and, do an interrogation process of, well, how did this enter my life? And how does it actually make me feel? And, what are the long, medium, short-term benefits of this one thing? If it is state and culturally sanctioned, they'll enjoy it. And the inverse is true as well, where if it is stigmatized, illegal, and can result in you being put in a steel cage, well, then it must be really bad for you. But if that is a veneer that, gets quickly dismantled when you actually look into these substances, and a good heuristic that exposes that is if alcohol were illegal and you were tasked to go to, a congressional hearing in DC and make the case why it should be made legal, I mean, you'd be laughed out of the room. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, skyrocketing healthcare costs, DUIs, domestic violence in bars, airports. I mean, the long list of damage that alcohol does, it would never be taken seriously if it were illegal today and you had to make a compelling argument for legalization. Now let's flip that over and we can use psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. They've been around for thousands of years. There's evidence that, multiple civilizations across, continents and cultures and geographies used psilocybin in some context or another. Very little risk profile, not addictive whatsoever. Um, and now over the last few years, we've just studied this modality extensively. It can cure almost every ailment known to man. It can create bliss, joy. It's an aphrodisiac. And yet, the consumption of this mushroom can result in going to jail. I mean, you cannot square that circle. And I think, the real download, the real takeaway from that is just laws and what we think is bad versus good is not it's not moored in reality. It's just, legacy. It's there's a lot of perverse incentives financially, and there's a whole host of reasons that people go through their lives never realizing that the substances that they're using are probably not all that good for them, and the ones that they're being deprived of could actually benefit them in ways they never really could imagine.
Well, I think one of the things that I like to do on the Alternative Flight Plan podcast is to kind of open the doors for questioning our beliefs around the conventional versus what's considered alternative. At some point, I would love to see the kind of medicine that we do not be alternative and just be another choice, rather than being labeled something that's off label, if you will. Um, oh my gosh, and we can go into the whole schedule thing with, no medical use and highly addictive, which we know is certainly not the case. I think one of your recent posts was about the type of preparation that goes into I call them ceremonies or an experience or whatever it is. And the fact that these things are for people who use them intentionally, that it's not taken lightly, as opposed to my boss pissed me off, so I go home and have a beer, or I had a bad taste, so I go home and have a beer. I have never, ever done that with psychedelics ever. And I suspect that you have not either.
Yeah, I mean, just the opposite. I postponed, cancel, reschedule ceremonies because something happened in the days or weeks leading up that affected my mindset, and I knew, venturing into a place where you are going to lose agency, going into the unknown when you're not in a peaceful, clear place, is a recipe for potential disaster. And that isn't my that's not exclusive to me. I have in a decade in this space, whether it's MDMA or 2CB or psilocybin, I've yet to come across someone who impulsively grabs at the bottle of MDMA and says, "Well, I'm in a great mood or I'm in a really bad mood, and this is what we're going to do tonight." I mean, these, just by the experience is so powerful that they demand, reverence and intention and a cadence that is so antithetical to how people consume alcohol.
Yeah, we consume alcohol without even a thought. Weddings, let's have a drink. Bad day, let's have a drink. It's not even there's no mindfulness at all whatsoever when it comes to, which is interesting because if you look at the history, what is the mysteries of Eleusis? I'm probably butchering that, but at some point, wine or grape, some sort of fermented grape product was probably a vehicle for something way more spiritual than it is now.
Yeah, the Eleusinian Mysteries is a fascinating. I've explored that one extensively in my writing. We don't know for sure. We don't have certitude around what transpired, other than we know like the Socrates and Aristotle's and the who's who of ancient Greece certainly attended. We know that much, and it's very likely the Kikion, the name of the brew that they consumed, was psychoactive. And we know, the conversations are, and this is anecdotal, but the conversations that emanated from Eleusis are eerily similar to what you would hear at a ceremony or a gathering of psychonauts. A lot of talk about death, the afterlife, meaning. So, those parallels certainly support a narrative that it wasn't just, fermented grapes and that there was something more cognitively stimulating occurring there.
You just mentioned death, and it's one of the topics that you explore, although I haven't done a lot of reading. Maybe if I went back a little bit further, I could see a little bit more. But I'm curious what got you into that. We don't normally start thinking about our mortality and death until we get older, at least in our culture. Like what turned you on to that as something that you wanted to dive into?
Yeah, I think it's tethered to my origin story. So I've unfortunately dealt with a lot of loss in an early life, and it was the first loss that I experienced was the catalyst to go and explore psychedelics. Um, and it was kind of an interesting story. I was not fully prepared. I had just read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. So this was circa 2019. I was about I think 5 years removed from losing my sister, and I think the grief was still at that point in my life. It still had agency over me, where it could affect me and in ways that I don't think were admirable in terms of living a normal, healthy life. I read this book, and like serendipitously, a few days after I finished it, a friend of mine in the gym was going to a ceremony. I asked if I could tag along. I've now since learned that these ceremonies are very inclusive, and you can always tag along. Um, and I remember on the car ride there, she had asked me, "Are you ready? Have you read the emails?" And I was like, "No, I don't. I'm not a big email guy." And I said, "What are we doing today? Like eating some mushrooms?" And she's like, "No, today's the toad." And I instantly knew what that was. The toad is 5-MeO-DMT, aka the world's most powerful psychedelic, and one of the strong beliefs of 5-MeO is that it does, of all the psychedelics, it closely replicates the experience of dying. And in fact, to the point where it's customary where after you have your experience, it's usually about 10 to 15 minutes. It's a very brief, very powerful ride. When you come back, the shamans and everyone yells happy birthday because you died and were reborn. And so I've done it 4 times now. I spread this one out. I don't recommend people do 5-MeO with any sort of, I think even once a year is too much. But um, if it's true that this is the closest thing to simulating what passing on feels like, then we have nothing to fear. And it is. I mean, it's terrifying and it's beautiful and it's profound and esoteric and all the things. And um, to me, it just made me kind of fascinated with the idea of what happens when we die. And I think when you lose someone close to you, that curiosity is just going to be triggered more than someone who, maybe only lost a grandparent. And so that's why that kind of started my journey with 5-MeO, and the work there has been enlightening to say the least about what might happen during our time of passing.
Wow, that's a hell of a way to dip your toe into the psychedelic water, so to speak. I have not done Bufo. I've witnessed it many times as a co-facilitator, but I've never experienced it myself. I look forward to trying it someday, but it's just not my time. Um, so, like, there's so much to unpack with just the Bufo. Happy birthday, rebirth. Like, I'm going to ask. I know what your answer is going to be, but I want my audience to hear it. Like, what else on the planet can do what this stuff does?
Really good question. I'm of the belief, and I get challenged on this, and it's a debate I enjoy having. Um, I'm of the belief that when it comes to 5-EO, there is nothing that can replicate that. Um, Now, I think with other, I get a lot of pushback from the meditation breathwork crowd, which I also belong to. I do transcendental meditation every single solitary day. I have a weekly breathwork practice that I love. I've done a private breathwork, led by a very well-known facilitator, and that was a transcendent experience. And I could see their argument that it mimics, a medium dose psilocybin or a low dose changa or something to that effect. 5-MeO was so powerful, so unprecedented, so surreal. I mean, it's like being inside a tesseract of the most beautiful vibrational, atoms are splitting and quantums and everything. And you're being the whole time being bathed in this cosmic love. Like I am skeptical that you could reach that place via a meditation practice. So that one psychedelic, which to me is the most powerful, and I've done almost all of them. I don't think anything can come near that, other than maybe death itself, and maybe just to be benevolent towards my people that challenge me on this. Like, yeah, okay, maybe if you go to Tibet and spend 20 years meditating on the side of a mountain, you can reach non-duality and that awareness and the cosmic consciousness. But I don't think a guided meditation on YouTube is going to get you anywhere near where 5-MeO does.
It's a shortcut. It's cheating, isn't it?
Yeah, I've heard that one. Yeah, it's cheating, but I think I don't know. I mean, my default response to that is like humans love drugs. We always have. This isn't a cultural glitch. I mean, across every civilization. I mean, the Native Americans in the U.S. were using peyote 5,000 years ago. That's before we developed language. So before we could talk, we were altering our state of consciousness. So if it's cheating, then every human civilization is guilty of that as well.
Personally don't think it's cheating. I think it's being smart. Like, if I could go to Tibet for 20 years and I had nothing else to do, that'd be awesome. And maybe I've spent many lifetimes there. I don't know. But if I have a substance that can help me deal with the world as it is today in 2026, then hell yes, I'm gonna investigate that for sure. But a lot of what you're talking about, and we haven't even got into the psychedelics for the healing thing. We'll get there, but a lot of what we're talking about is esoteric and spirituality, which I think is a big part of what's missing. And because this is a healthcare based podcast, and mostly what I've been talking about is psychedelics. What I meant to talk about was naturopathic medicine and alternative medicine. But I wonder how you feel about the lack of spirituality in our medicine today, and how this. Well, okay, let's just go with that for a second, and then we'll go from there.
What it's attracted is a lot of faux spirituality. In some circles, I've heard this called Austin spirituality, where I lived for a year and it was very abundant there. And I think if you are someone who is, on the dark triad, if you're a narcissist, if you're someone who relishes in power control over others, the psychedelic space, I mean, you must be salivating at it, because the barrier to entry is so low. You learn a few catchphrases, you speak the language, you get plausible deniability in the form of, well, I've accessed the divine and therefore I know things that you don't. And then you are around people who are, and I'm certainly in this cohort, open to new experience, porous to new ideas and alternative ways of thinking about the world. And with that, if you're not careful, is there probably a scintilla of gullibility. And so I think the starting point of the challenge of the lack of spirituality has actually been how attractive it is for people to enter the space with nefarious intent. And we see this with, charlatan shamans running ayahuasca ceremonies in Temecula, where, I've attended some of these where they'll talk about ayahuasca like it's this healing medicine for thousands of years. I mean, not a single word of that is true. Most anthropologists think it goes back around 300-400 years. And the healing narrative is brand new. This was used for sorcery, seduction, warfare among rival shamans. Humans are going to human. This idea that it was always, a powerful medicine to, talk to your inner child is completely nonsense. And so, I think the starting point of the lack of spirituality has to do with, who entered the space. And yeah, hopefully in my writing, I try to, even though I'm clearly spiritual, I've had events that completely defy any rational materialist frameworks. I still try to always ground in truth and what we know and what we can prove.
I've got two thoughts on that. One is if we sanitize it a little bit for the average Western person, and that gives them the courage to try something that might blow their mind a little bit, maybe it's not so bad. But if we remove it too much, then what's the point? It's just another Western modality to try to fix something that we haven't been able to fix so far. And I'm watching that play out in, obviously my interest is Navy veteran, is in the veteran community, and the healing of PTSD and all that sort of thing. It is interesting to see a lot of documentaries where, professional athletes and special warfare guys go into this as really broken folks and come out. And the thing is, they're not talking about this great pharmaceutical that they took and now I feel better. They talk about seeing God and having this amazing mystical experience. And as we try to separate the mysticism from the medicine, I wonder if that's appropriate.
I think that's incredibly important. And there are countless examples of, medicines throughout history whose use case ended up being completely divorced from why they were conceived, right? Viagra in the 90s that was started as a blood pressure medicine. It didn't do much for blood pressure, but we know what it did do, and it became, the biggest money-making pharmaceutical in the late 90s. So just because ayahuasca, let's use that one as an example, just because its history certainly was not in healing, certainly not as an organizing principle. That doesn't mean that clearly there seems to be a tremendous amount of potential for it healing, veterans and people with complex PTSD. Ibogaine is another one where while the history is a lot more sordid and probably darker than most either acknowledge or know, clearly there is something about the Buddhist lifestyle review, the way it works on the brain, that for people that have, experienced combat or have had severe trauma and complex PTSD, it can absolutely, be a healing modality. So I think the reason I still think it's important to not sanitize is because when you start getting into these tier one psychedelics, the ayahuascas, the samadhis, iboga, even changa, I would put in that list. You know, the mind is a can be a dangerous place. It can be a peaceful day at the beach, or it can be a category 5 hurricane. And when you are going to transcend baseline consciousness, and the nuance is very important. I'm not talking about taking a small amount of MDMA with your partner or a medium dose of psilocybin on the beach with trusted friends. I'm talking when you're going in deep, you don't know where your mind's going to go. And so I think giving people all of the information, all of the history, all of the facts, so they are empowered to make a decision for them. And yeah, obviously it's sensical that if you are a veteran who's struggling, that risk reward is going to be worth it. If your mind goes to a dark place, well, your mind is in a dark place all the time. Why wouldn't you explore this modality?
One of the interesting things that I've seen you write about is when to use psychedelics, and if life is good, then perhaps that's not a time. Um, I'm on the fence about that because there's this part of me that wants to, even if life is good, to continue experiencing and opening my mind to more possibility and peeling back the layers on belief systems. But there's some truth to that, maybe that if you're feeling good, then Pandora's box maybe not the place that you want to go.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the psychedelic and how you define life going good. Um, you know, a great example is I'm in my early 40s. So a lot of my friends have very young children. They're at that phase of life of, starting families. And I would not recommend they fly down to the Amazon and work with ayahuasca. They're at a point where life itself is psychedelic. They're inundated with constant novelty, raising a 2 and a 5-year-old. They're uh, destabilizing your mind at a time like that. To me, the risk reward calculation becomes a little bit more precarious. Now, if one of those same people said, hey, like, you know, we're going to put the kids are going to bed early and me and my wife are going to do a microdose of psilocybin, totally different conversation. We're allowed to have fun. We're allowed to experience joy. And back to the alcohol conversation, as an alcohol replacement, a small dose of MDMA, a small dose of psilocybin, so much better. I would highly recommend it for health reasons, spiritual reasons, and just pure enjoyment reasons, any day of the week. But when it comes to what I call the tier ones, the really powerful ones, I think there are a lot of times in life where it's probably best to hold off.
I'll get behind that totally. So one of the things you write a lot about is the scaffolding. And I think you've actually used that word specifically. And so I'd love to dive a little bit more into your perspective on what it is that psychedelics actually do. For example, they don't fix the relationship, they open up your perception to see truth. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is one of the most fascinating parts of these tools. Their their impact on our perception, and this is something where I have both read a ton about, DMT and what's happening with the brain there. And, the way that a lot of these molecules interact with the brain is befuddling to scientists. Iboga massages almost every neural network we have in the brain. Like that there's no other compound that we know of in nature or made in a lab that does that. DMT, there's these stories across cultures and time about entities and what's happening there. Like, how does the brain um, create this entity when, we can't dream in a language that we don't know, right? So the brain is constantly just working off prior experience and sensory input, yet on this novel compound that's been around for years, Yopo and Colombia, now being used a lot here in the U.S. And Mexico. what is actually transpiring. Like, how does the brain create this intricate world when it has no prior to go off of? It is tantamount to dreaming in Mandarin Chinese if you've never heard a word in that language. So, um, but it's also, I marry that a lot with my personal experience. And, one I had with a very obscure psychedelic called samadhi. Most people don't know it. It's the same underlying molecules as ayahuasca. So it's DMT combined with MAOI inhibitors that slows down the breakdown of DMT, which takes the experience from 20 minutes to several hours. Um, and it's very common here in Mexico. There's a lot of shamans who they believe you should only work with the plant local to the ecosystem that you're in. That's bad news for people doing like ayahuasca ceremonies in Texas, but and samadhi is extracted from plants here in local to Mexico. And I remember the morning after my samadhi journey, like having coffee, just sitting on the balcony, like every single decision I ever made romantically, good or bad, was delivered to me. I mean, it almost felt like you're like floating. Like it was an unbelievable moment of clarity that can't be attributed to anything else besides the medicine that I'd done the previous night. Um, and that story is not at all rare. I've known countless people who have gone and done an ayahuasca ceremony and had like a vision of their wife and their future family, and within 2 years that had all come to fruition. So what is it about these molecules that allows us to, unprecedented insight and access into our patterns, into who we're, the life we were supposed to live versus the life we're living? And the way that these tools deliver it is also fascinating, where it isn't like a judgmental, well, you went wrong here, or you made a left and you should have made a right. It's this just completely honest, non-judgmental, kind of beautiful clarity that those who have worked with a tier one psychedelic will, listening to this, will be able to reflect on and be like, yeah, like it taught me what I needed to know. And, in the absence of that, I wonder I would, if I would be continuing just on the same, trajectory of failed relationships and pursuing the wrong types of partners, had it not been for that one experience.
It is hard to deny I'm gonna say truth, although truth is, I think, relative to each of us. But, as you reflect back on your life experiences, once you realize something, I think Eckhart Tolle said it, once you wake up, you can't go back to sleep. And once you experience those things and you see the truth, it's like, I can't unsee them now. And the challenge post ceremony or post experience is, okay, well, how do I implement a new way of living with a structure that is still based on the old way?
Yeah, well, now we're getting into the integration world, which is, integration is one of these very challenging words that, if you put 10 people in a room and ask them to define it, even people that are experts in the space, you'd probably get 9 or 10 definitions of what it means. And probably there's some of that is just based on how individual archetypes like really do process and integrate information. But it is so important. I try to convey this in the blog a lot, where absent of an integration process that works for you, whatever that might look like, journaling, meditation, speaking to a friend, whatever it is, absent of that, you really aren't going to download these lessons. They're not, they'll be ephemeral, and you just played like the world's coolest video game. But you probably haven't, meaningfully course corrected on things that the medicine taught you. And a lot of shamans will tell you like the best way to extend gratitude back to the medicine for gifting you this experience is to meaningfully integrate, the lessons that it gave you into your life going forward.
Perhaps the word integration is just the way for the healing community to get their hands around using insights. I just call it learning. The funny thing is that because one of the guests I'm going to have coming up is somebody who's been involved in plant medicine, but she does art therapy. And she went from being in corporate America to being somebody who is doing art to heal from TBI and trauma. Um, like there's no talk therapy in art. It's just art. And the ability for the body and the brain to integrate these experiences by doing some sort of expression, creative expression, is absolutely fascinating to me. Um, but that may be a conversation for another time. You are also, you've been writing a little bit about the underground cannabis community in Mexico. I did not realize that cannabis was not legal there, and I'm curious what your experiences are with that.
Yeah, I recently took a trip to Mexico City a few weeks back. It's part of a new feature I'm rolling out with the blog where I think it's going to be. I mean, I think on the ground experience is always important, but I think as we're heading into a more of an AI world, that's going to be the differentiator. People that are on the ground reporting, experiencing the things that they're talking about. AI can't replicate that, right? Whereas, like, if you're just giving people the news, that's probably going to be a relic of the past before we know it. And so, I have this new feature called Global Altered States, where I'm going to go to different places where altered state culture is actively evolving. I'm actually going to LA on Friday. There's a huge 2CB kind of thriving culture there. I'm going to explore. We can get into that if you'd like. But for when I went to Mexico City, I knew I've been living in Puerto Vallarta for over a year now, so I knew about cannabis not being legal. But what surprised me was there are these cannabis clubs, and they operate kind of in purgatory between secrecy and look the other way. And they have and I went to one. Luckily, I was able to make friends with a woman who's been working on the underground in cannabis for 11 years. She's originally from Colombia, but she's been in CDMX for a long time. And she took me along to one of these clubs, and it kind of operates tantamount to how maybe you'd envision, a bar during Prohibition in the US in the 1920s would operate, where, kind of a speakeasy vibe, a lot of handshakes, donations, not, payment. And, cannabis really is, there's an interesting thing when you stigmatize a substance that shouldn't be stigmatized and make people go through these types of endeavors to enjoy it. It does create a reverence for the product. I remember at one point I slipped and called it like weed, and everyone was like, I made a huge social faux pas, which I'm not, which is not that's certainly not atypical for me. So it was okay. I know how to manage those emotions, but there was a lot of reverence towards cannabis, and there's a lot of people trying to drive it towards legality. Whether or not they win remains to be seen. But in the meantime, I found it very interesting that there's these kind of underground clubs where people are going to smoke a little bit of cannabis and have a good time.
I loved your description because I remember reading, maybe it was last week or the week prior. I love your description of how everything just kind of slowed down, and cannabis kind of does that anyway. But
Yeah,
still, just
I was gonna
but
say I was also fun.
having
So yeah.
having the experience, and it felt very speakeasy. It was almost like walking into a bar in Key West
Mm,
back in the day.
yeah.
Anyway, it just it just reminded me that I don't know. This is one of those moments where I'm like, my brain stopped. Um, one of the things I'm trying to do with this podcast, also, I'm going to have a guest on that is in the cannabis community here locally on the Olympic Peninsula, Washington. I want to destigmatize, even though it's legal here. There are still a lot of stigmas, and people still call it weed. And like, no, it's cannabis, man. It's cannabis, and it's a dispensary. It's not a pot shop, man. Um, but the more we can do to destigmatize it, and I don't want to treat it like alcohol because I think alcohol is like we don't treat that well either, but at least give it the respect it's due for the power that that particular plant has.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you might have seen that there was a New York Times piece that was, basically propaganda, in my opinion, against cannabis, complete omission of all counterfactuals, you know, anomaly hunting for adverse events. And yeah, I mean, if there are some people with any substance, there's a group of people that should not use it. Those bipolar, schizophrenic, cannabis can be a very dangerous substance for sure. But the idea that the solution to some of the problems or challenges that arise is to have the state just put it back into Schedule One. I mean, it's just silly. And we saw how that played out. Like, it was easier to get cannabis when it was illegal than it was when it was legal. At least when I lived in LA for a long time, like when all the dispensaries opened up and it went from medicinal to recreational, and we all threw away our medicinal cards. Within a few months, we were going back to the people we bought it from on the black market because it was less expensive. Like, so, yeah, there's a whole conversation there. So I'm glad you're speaking to it. Waisse.
That's what capitalism is all about, is capitalizing on what people need. And unfortunately, there is a great need for this type of medicine. Um, you mentioned the word experience earlier, and a lot of times instead of calling it a ceremony, I call it an experience. And I think it's one of the important things that exists around these types of medicines is whereas something like, and I've done ketamine as well, whereas ketamine or alcohol it's about taking you out of the experience. I feel like these things really bring you into the experience, which um, m- m- is one of the few medicines that brings you back into your body, and maybe that's part of how it does its healing work. But it's also how we get to experience some really cool things as a human being on planet Earth.
I think that's well said. I drank for most of my adult life. I quit 8 years ago. So I know, but I was a good drinker. I enjoyed it. And, I know what alcohol feels like, and I know what a MDMA ceremony with your partner, at home, candles lit, playlist. I know what that feels like, and, I mean, the experiences aren't even in the same stratosphere in terms of embodiment, in terms of feelings of unprecedented love and connection and empathy and euphoria, all grounded in real emotions and truth. And, a lot of people don't know this about MDMA, but when Shulgin reintroduced it in the '70s, it was it was showing miraculous, benefit to couples and couples therapy, to the point where therapists wrote into President Reagan a few years later telling him to keep MDMA out of his war on drugs. He didn't acquiesce to that request, and that's when in the black market, it got relegated, and it popped up in clubs in London, Chicago, and Dallas, and then from there it cascaded. And to this day, where now if I say Molly or MDMA, the mousetrap in the brain goes off, and people assume, clubs, rave, festival, Coachella, you name the buzzword, but that was never its intent. And its real power, its real benefit is, couples therapy, PTSD for those who have, served or been through a traumatic event, or just, two people on the couch, that trust each other and love each other. It can be a beautiful experience. And, I think I've had countless friends who, once they started exploring that modality, within a few months, I get a text like, dude, we don't even drink anymore, or like, we drink so little now because we just can't wait for our twice a year MDMA night. So I think that's quite beautiful.
Yeah, as things get regulated, I got two thoughts on, regulation on one hand is it makes access a little bit harder. Like you talked about cannabis. Boy, the price really went up, and it just makes it hard for people that need it for medicinal purposes to get it cheaply. But on the other hand, I think it does, in some ways, help keep people a little bit safer, because one of the concerns here, like I'm near a major city, Seattle, and getting product laced with fentanyl is a real concern.
There's a lot of really good arguments, and I don't have, I'm not married to any one of them about, decrim, or, what is the best way to bring these to the public safely. And I think, cannabis, it's much lower risk. If you get bad cannabis, it's just going to be weak, or, not that potent. But to your point, MDMA that isn't safely sourced could be fentanyl, could be laced with other chemicals. So I think, we have to follow what, what is safest, but that's not what it is right now, because people want these medicines, they want access, and they're, hopefully getting it from someone that they can kind of trust. And that is not the ideal way to do it.
I do find it funny when I start having conversations with my patients, because I'm connected to a whole network. Like veterans, like we're all connected. Not really, but a lot of us are. Anyway, the veteran footprint within the psychedelic space is significant, and the access and the ability for people to get the resources they need is significant within these networks. And so as soon as you start opening the door to these conversations, I usually wait for people to ask me rather than the other way around. They're like, "Oh my god, I had no idea this was so." I'm going to use the word easy. Uh, I don't want somebody knocking down my door, hauling me off to jail. But I mean, I work with people in Colorado, and it's legal in Colorado, so you can access it there. But I think a lot of the challenge is getting people to peel back the layers of fear they have in having the conversation in the first place, and then asking for what they need or what they want or what they're curious about.
Yeah. 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 Well said. I wouldn't have anything to add to that. I think that nails it.
Let's see. We have looking at my notes. I, I'm just going to ask because I'm curious. Ever had any bad experiences?
I haven't had like a bad trip. I've interviewed people and I've read some stories of some people that have had some, what I would call like a destabilizing journey where for weeks, months after that they couldn't return to baseline consciousness or interact with reality in a way that you normally would. I have not had anything on that level. I did have one with samadhi. I've done that twice. And my first samadhi journey was probably a little bit too close to losing someone. I probably should have spaced it out more, and it's what I would classify as a harrowing journey, a challenging journey, um, but nothing in the realm of bad trips where I'm struggling to go about my day months after the fact.
Yeah, I haven't had that as well. But I always like to ask the conversation because people think that there's this like it's bound to happen. You're going to have a bad journey. And there's also the other side of the coin where, in the healing community, they like to say is no such thing as a bad journey. And it's all just, unintegrated. Well, I don't know. Let's be careful how we describe that. I have had some experiences that I would call harrowing as well. I think that's a great word to describe them. And it's not because the medicine was bad or the situation was bad. It's just that it was a lot for my nervous system. And, much like you said, maybe it was too close to doing some other things and I really should have spaced those out more. But in situations where I've had people sitting for me and I've been working with what I would call professionals, even a harrowing situation has turned out pretty well for me. So I hope to keep that track record going.
Sorry, yeah, I think, there's a great book, The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter, and he talks about how, once a year doing something that terrifies you, the Japanese have a word for it, I think it's called misogi. Whether it's, a crazy hike, don't die, right? For me, I go bungee jumping or I skydive at least once a year. A tier one psychedelic can be that, because what happens is, to your point, Kristen, like the aftermath of doing something that terrified you or that was terrifying is some of the best bliss you'll ever experience. But I would also argue the people that say there's no such thing as a bad trip. Another one of their mantras is the medicine always knows. Like maybe it knows your conscious. It doesn't know your cardiovascular health. It doesn't know if you're schizophrenic. Like that is the mark of a charlatan, in my opinion. Like those are people that have no business administering medicine to someone, because if a schizophrenic takes ayahuasca, they're not going to have a bad trip. They're going to end up in the psych ward for several years. People that have bipolar, other than ketamine, there's no psychedelic they can use that won't send them into serotonin syndrome and the ER. Bufo is cardiotoxic. If you have an underlying heart issue, the medicine's not going to know that, and you could end up in the ER or worse. So I think, yeah, I strongly push back against the people that use these like catchphrases when we're talking about very powerful tools.
I think the best phrase is just we don't know what we don't know. I remain fascinated by psychedelics, and it's if people who have been listening to me a while know. Mostly my friends listen to my podcast. They know that I came from a really conservative place, and the fact that I'm even into these things is a little bit bizarre. But I'm curious about the human experience, and I'm curious about how the experience in our mind coexists with the experience that happens in our body. And I can't wait to see how this unfolds in our country in the next 5, 10, or 20 years. Where therapy goes, where mental health goes. And where the science of neurology goes as a result of allowing these things back into the conversation of alternative medicine.
Yeah, same. I align with that curiosity as well.
Well, it's one of the things that made me stop and read your blog. And I consistently, it's one of the few that I actually read every time I get on Substack, which admittedly is not often. I try to avoid social media, but Substack is one of those places I feel safe. um, Yeah. So, thanks for the work you're doing. I appreciate your honesty. Like when you change your mind, you say, "Hey, I changed my mind," or "I was wrong." And I think that's a really important part of the conversation as we grow. Of course, we're going to change, and being honest about that and being forthcoming about how that manifests in our day-to-day lives is really important. So, thank you for everything that you do on the blog, and I look forward to continue reading in the future. Okay. Before we close, if you want to share with people how they can find you, whatever social medias you want to share, please do that. Yeah. All right. He is the psychedelic blog. That's Andrew Weisse. Thanks for joining us today. If you're in the state of Washington, I'm not on social media, but I have social media platforms. So you can find me at Instagram, Dr. Kristen Barnes. Alternative Flight Plan has a Facebook page. Meridian Passage has a Facebook page. I'm on LinkedIn, Kristen Barnes. You can find me, reach out to me, hello@meridianpassagewellness.com. And if you're in the state of Washington and you want medical care, I'm here for you. I have conversations about chronic pain, psychedelics, hormones, digestive health, whatever you need. I do telemedicine. Reach out and we can set up a consult to chat about what you need. So thanks for tuning into the Alternative Flight Plan podcast. We're going to bring it in to the pattern, get a landing on an OK 3-wire. I know that, Andrew, that probably doesn't mean anything to you, but for the 3 naval aviators that are listening, they'll know what that means. That means we're gonna end the episode and bring it in. Thanks very much for listening, and for my producer, because she'll like this part. If you liked what you heard today, please like, share, and subscribe so we can get the word out about everything that we're doing. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.